Hi there, and welcome to Q English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. James Joyce, A Life in Words. Chapter 1. Roots in Dublin. James Augustine Aloysius Joyce was born on February 2, 1882, in Rathgar, a suburb of Dublin, Ireland. He was the eldest of 10 surviving children in a middle-class Catholic family. From the very beginning, Joyce's life was shaped by a mixture of tradition, change, and challenge elements that would later echo in his writing. Joyce's father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was a talented singer and a charming storyteller, but he struggled to manage money. He once held good positions in the civil service, but his love for drinking and poor financial decisions eventually led the family into poverty. Still, John's wit and powerful voice left a lasting impression on young James. His mother, Mary Jane Murray, was a kind and religious woman. She loved music and passed on a deep sense of Irish culture to her children. From a young age, James showed signs of exceptional intelligence. He learned to read before most children his age, and he was deeply curious about the world around him. His early life was filled with stories those told by his father, read by his mother, or heard in the streets of Dublin. The city, with its narrow alleys, horse-drawn carts, and crowded pubs, would later become the center stage of his most famous works. When James was 6 years old, he was sent to Clongowes Wood College, a strict Jesuit boarding school. This was a significant turning point in his life. The Jesuits were known for their rigorous education and discipline. Joyce felt both admiration and fear. He quickly rose to the top of his class in subjects like Latin, English, and history. However, he also experienced loneliness and illness. At one point, he was sent home due to a painful eye infection, which became the beginning of his lifelong vision problems. The family's financial situation worsened. John Joyce lost more jobs, and the family moved frequently, each new house smaller and less comfortable than the last. By the time James was a teenager, they had lived in at least a dozen different addresses in Dublin. Despite the instability, James continued to excel in school, now attending Belvedere College, another Jesuit institution. Here, he won several academic prizes and even began to explore writing more seriously. His poems, essays, and short plays showed a mature voice beyond his age. One of the most important aspects of Joyce's early life was his growing awareness of religion, politics, and identity. He lived in a country under British rule, in a society deeply divided by class and faith. Though raised Catholic, Joyce began to question the Church's teachings. He saw both beauty and hypocrisy in religious life, and this inner conflict would remain with him for years. His feelings about Ireland, its traditions, and its limitations also began to form. While he loved the rhythm of Irish speech and the spirit of its people, he felt suffocated by its conservative culture. By the age of 16, Joyce had already developed a unique view of the world. He believed in the power of the individual and the importance of art. He admired great thinkers like Henrik Ibsen, Dante, and Thomas Aquinas. He began to see himself as different from those around him, not just as a student, but as an artist in the making. Joyce's early writings reflect both his personal experiences and the intellectual battles he was already fighting. His short essay, A Confession of Faith, written at age 17, boldly declared his rejection of religion and his belief in literature. For him, writing was not just a talent, it was a mission. He wanted to speak the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, and even if it meant standing alone. Though still a teenager, James Joyce was already becoming the man he would one day be: complex, critical, and endlessly curious. The seeds of his genius had been planted in a childhood full of contrast: poverty and education, faith and doubt, love and disappointment. Chapter 2. A Jesuit Education. Education played a central role in James Joyce's life. It was not just a way to gain knowledge, but a path to personal freedom. After leaving Clongowes Wood College, due to his family's declining financial situation, Joyce was enrolled at Belvedere College, another prestigious Jesuit school. There, he began to truly shine as a student and as a thinker. At Belvedere, Joyce's academic performance was outstanding. He won multiple scholarships and writing prizes, which greatly helped his struggling family. He was especially gifted in literature and languages, excelling in Latin, French, and English. His teachers recognized his talent, and some even predicted a brilliant future for him. However, Joyce already had complex feelings about the education system and the Catholic Church that operated it. The Jesuits had a clear mission: to guide students not only intellectually but morally. They encouraged obedience, loyalty, and religious faith. For many students, this was comforting, but for Joyce, it became a challenge. He admired the Jesuits for their discipline and intellectual strength, yet he also saw the limitations in their rigid beliefs. As he grew older, he began to question authority, especially religious authority. One powerful moment in Joyce's education was his experience of spiritual retreat, a common practice in Jesuit schools. During these retreats, students were asked to reflect deeply on sin, death, and the afterlife. While others were moved to tears, Joyce responded with critical thinking. He started to wonder if guilt and fear were truly necessary parts of belief. These early doubts would later appear in his writing, where characters struggle with the same spiritual conflicts. At the age of 16, Joyce began to separate himself mentally from the traditions of his family and country. He still respected his roots, but he no longer accepted things blindly. He wanted to form his own opinions through reading, thinking, and writing. This independent spirit set him apart from his classmates, who often followed religious and social norms without question. In 1898, Joyce entered University College Dublin, where he studied modern languages, particularly English, French, and Italian. The university gave him more freedom than his previous schools. He no longer had to attend Mass or confession. Instead, he could explore ideas that had once been considered dangerous or forbidden. He read writers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Baudelaire, and Leo Tolstoy. These authors helped him understand human nature in a new way, one that was raw, honest, and unafraid of contradiction. Joyce became a known figure on campus. He wasn't part of any major student clubs or political groups. Instead, he spent his time reading widely, observing people, and writing essays and poems. His appearance stood out: tall, thin, with sharp eyes behind round glasses. He spoke in a confident and often ironic tone. He challenged his professors in class discussions and refused to accept simple answers to complex questions. Though he admired art and literature, Joyce disliked how Irish society treated its artists. He believed that Ireland was too focused on religion and politics, and too quick to criticize those who thought differently. He once said, "I fear those big words which make us so unhappy." Words like patriotism, duty, and faith often carried heavy expectations, and Joyce wanted none of them forced upon him. In 1900, Joyce published his first article, a review of the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, in the Fortnightly Review, a respected English journal. His admiration for Henrik Ibsen was strong. He saw Ibsen as a modern hero, someone who challenged traditional morality through drama. This article brought him brief attention in Dublin's literary circles and marked the beginning of his public literary life. Still, not everything was smooth. Joyce's ideas were often misunderstood. His professors considered him too arrogant. Some friends found him distant or difficult, but Joyce remained focused. He once wrote in a letter, "I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe." This line would later appear in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, a novel that mirrors much of Joyce's own life. By the time he graduated from university in 1902, James Joyce was no longer just a student. He was a young man with a mission to use art as a form of truth, to explore the depths of human experience, and to challenge the old structures of religion, nation, and language. His education had not made him obedient, it had made him free. And freedom, as Joyce would show the world, was the beginning of something extraordinary. Chapter 3: University Years and Literary Awakening. James Joyce completed his studies at University College Dublin in 1902, graduating with a degree in modern languages. Yet, even with his excellent education, he felt unsure about what to do next. Dublin, the city of his birth, now seemed too small, too conservative, too unwilling to accept the kind of writer he was becoming. Joyce knew he had ideas that went beyond Ireland's borders, ideas that needed space, challenge, and freedom. He began to feel like an outsider in his own land. During this time, Joyce was deeply involved in reading, thinking, and writing. He had already published a few reviews and essays and was beginning to shape his vision as a writer. He started keeping notebooks filled with observations, character sketches, and language experiments. The streets, conversations, and contradictions of Dublin were everywhere in his notes. But rather than celebrate Irish culture in a traditional way, Joyce wanted to reveal its inner truths, including its limitations and hidden pains. One of Joyce's great inspirations was the French writer Gustave Flaubert, whose novel Madame Bovary taught him the power of detailed, realistic storytelling. Joyce admired how Flaubert paid attention to ordinary life, showing the inner thoughts of his characters with honesty. Joyce began to believe that literature didn't have to be heroic or romantic, it could be truthful, even if that truth was uncomfortable. He also continued to explore philosophy, especially the ideas of Aristotle, Aquinas, and Schopenhauer, as well as modern thinkers like Nietzsche. These readings shaped how he thought about human consciousness, identity, and morality. He saw the artist not just as a storyteller, but as someone who could explore the deep structure of thought itself. But Joyce's relationship with Ireland grew more difficult. He tried to give a lecture on his ideas about literature at a local university, but few people attended. He sent stories and essays to Irish magazines, only to face rejection. He saw the Irish literary world as narrow-minded and too focused on politics or religion. While other writers were praised for celebrating Irish heroes and history, Joyce was more interested in exploring the inner life of modern people, especially those who felt lost, trapped, or confused. In November 1902, just after his graduation, Joyce made a bold decision. He left Ireland for Paris, hoping to study medicine. The choice was unusual. He had no clear plan, little money, and few connections. But he believed that Paris, the city of art and freedom, could offer him a life where he could grow as a writer and thinker. Life in Paris was hard. Joyce struggled to pay for food, books, and rent. He lived in cheap boarding houses, ate little, and sent long, lonely letters back home. Yet during this difficult time, he continued to write intensely. He read more French literature, attended lectures at the Sorbonne, and walked the streets, always observing the people and city life. The discipline of hardship helped sharpen his focus. It was here that Joyce first began shaping the idea of a collection of short stories that would later become Dubliners. In April 1903, Joyce returned to Dublin after learning that his mother was gravely ill. Mary Jane Joyce had always been a quiet but strong influence in his life. When she passed away in August, Joyce was deeply affected. He refused to pray at her deathbed, which caused tension with his family and added to his guilt. Her death became a powerful emotional event, later echoed in several of his stories and novels. After his mother's passing, Joyce entered one of the darkest emotional periods of his life. He struggled to find a job, argued frequently with his father, and began drinking more. Yet, through all of this, he never stopped writing. His experiences during this time shaped many of the themes that would define his literature: exile, guilt, memory, and the search for self. In 1904, things began to shift. Joyce met Nora Barnacle, a young woman from Galway working as a hotel chambermaid in Dublin. Though she was not educated in the way Joyce was, Nora had a practical wisdom and strength that deeply attracted him. They went on their first date on June 16, 1904, a date Joyce would later immortalize in Ulysses. Their bond grew quickly, and Joyce decided he would leave Ireland for good, bringing Nora with him. By October 1904, the two had left Dublin together. Joyce was only 22 years old, but he had made a radical choice to live in self-imposed exile for the sake of his art and his freedom. He believed that to fully become the writer he wanted to be, he had to break free from the limits of his homeland. As the ship carried them away from the Dublin shore, Joyce wasn't just escaping poverty or politics. He was beginning the journey of a lifetime, one that would transform both himself and the world of literature. Chapter 4: Love and Exile. In October 1904, James Joyce and Nora Barnacle left Ireland behind and began a new chapter in their lives, one of love, hardship, and creative struggle. Their destination was continental Europe, a world far different from the streets of Dublin. For Joyce, this move marked the start of his life in self-imposed exile, a decision that would shape his identity both as a man and as a writer. Their first stop was Zurich, Switzerland, but things didn't go as planned. Joyce had been promised a teaching job, but when he arrived, it turned out the offer was no longer valid. Disappointed but determined, he moved with Nora to Trieste, a port city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now in Italy, where he eventually found work teaching English at the Berlitz language school. Life in Trieste was not easy. The couple had little money, and Joyce often had to borrow from friends or write to family members back in Dublin for help. He sometimes taught students privately in cafes, offering lessons to local businessmen, sailors, and shopkeepers. These experiences helped him better understand different types of people, and he stored away their stories and personalities for future use in his fiction. Despite the daily struggles, Joyce and Nora began to build a life together. Their love was passionate but not always smooth. Joyce was emotional and often troubled by doubts and fears. Nora was practical and patient, though she sometimes found his ideas confusing or strange. Still, she became his anchor, supporting him through illness, poverty, and self-doubt. Their relationship would last the rest of their lives, and Nora would serve as the inspiration for several of his most important female characters, including Molly Bloom in Ulysses. In 1905, Joyce and Nora welcomed their first child, Giorgio, and 4 years later, their daughter, Lucia, was born. Joyce now had a family to care for, and this added both pressure and purpose to his life. He continued to work as a teacher while spending every spare moment writing. He began to seriously develop a series of short stories about life in Dublin, ordinary moments full of quiet pain, hope, and disappointment. This project would later become Dubliners. Joyce wanted to capture the soul of his homeland even though he had chosen to live far from it. He believed that by writing honestly about Dublin, he could express something universal about the human condition. He once said, "If I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world." To do this, he avoided grand plots or dramatic events. Instead, he focused on small but meaningful moments, conversations, silences, decisions made or not made. But getting Dubliners published proved difficult. Joyce faced multiple rejections from publishers, many of whom objected to the book's frank treatment of topics like poverty, politics, and sexuality. One publisher agreed to print the book, but later destroyed the entire run after legal threats. Joyce refused to remove or soften any parts. He believed deeply in artistic honesty, and he would not compromise. During these years in exile, Joyce also began work on a new project, a novel about a young man named Stephen Dedalus, based closely on himself. This would become a portrait of the artist as a young man. In this story, Stephen struggles with religion, family, and the desire to become an artist. Like Joyce, he chooses exile to find his own voice. In Trieste, Joyce met people who helped and challenged him. One of the most important was Italo Svevo, an Italian Jewish writer and businessman who became Joyce's student and friend. Svevo encouraged Joyce's literary ambitions and gave him moral and financial support. In return, Joyce saw in Svevo the seeds of a future character, Leopold Bloom, the modern hero of Ulysses. But not everything was stable. Joyce's health was fragile. He suffered from frequent eye problems, which would continue for the rest of his life. He also drank heavily and often argued with Nora or with friends. Yet, through all of this, he never stopped believing in his mission as a writer. He once described exile, silence, and cunning as the tools an artist must use to survive. Living in Trieste away from Ireland and its expectations gave Joyce the distance he needed to see his homeland more clearly. Through writing, he could return to Dublin again and again, not in body, but in memory and imagination. By 1914, after nearly a decade of effort, Dubliners was finally published. Though it did not bring him much money or fame at first, the book marked a turning point. Joyce had succeeded in doing what he set out to do, telling the truth about Irish life with compassion, clarity, and courage. Far from home, he had begun to find his voice, and the world was about to hear it. Chapter 5: The Birth of Dubliners and the Rise of a Voice. By 1914, James Joyce had lived in self-imposed exile for nearly a decade. He was still teaching English in Trieste, now the father of 2 children and deeply involved in his writing. While most of his energy was spent on supporting his family, Joyce never gave up his literary ambitions. He believed that his words could change how people saw life by capturing it exactly as it was. His first major success came after years of rejection, the publication of Dubliners. The road to publication had been long and painful. Joyce finished writing the collection in 1907, but he had begun drafting stories as early as 1904. Dubliners included 15 short stories, all set in his hometown. But unlike the patriotic or romantic literature popular in Ireland at the time, Joyce's stories were sharp, realistic, and deeply human. He wrote about failed dreams, paralyzed lives, and moments of quiet revelation. Each story focused on an individual's experience, but together, they told a larger truth about a society struggling with tradition, religion, and modern change. Joyce called this theme paralysis, the sense that many Irish people felt stuck, unable to move forward in life. In stories like The Sisters, Evelyn, and The Dead, readers could see characters struggling between duty and desire, memory and future. But publishers were afraid. They worried that some of the content was too controversial. Joyce's refusal to censor or edit key parts, especially language about the church, politics, or sexuality, meant that 4 publishers dropped the book after initially agreeing to print it. In one infamous case, a publisher destroyed the printed pages rather than risk a lawsuit. Joyce was devastated. He wrote to friends describing the experience as a long battle with blind and cowardly forces, but he never gave up. Finally, in 1914, Dubliners was published in London by Grant Richards, who had once rejected it but changed his mind. Joyce was 32 years old. Though it received only modest sales at first, critics began to notice its power. Reviewers admired the clarity of Joyce's language, the subtlety of his structure, and his ability to describe inner life without judgment. The final story, The Dead, was quickly seen as a masterpiece, a quiet tale of love, memory, and mortality that many called one of the greatest short stories ever written. The publication of Dubliners gave Joyce the confidence to pursue his next work more seriously, a portrait of the artist as a young man. This novel was based on an earlier, unfinished manuscript titled Stephen Hero, a longer and more detailed version of the same story. After revising it many times, Joyce created a leaner, more experimental form, focusing on language and thought rather than plot. Portrait follows the life of Stephen Dedalus, a fictional version of Joyce himself, from childhood to early adulthood. The novel shows Stephen as he grows up in a religious household, attends school, experiences doubt, guilt, rebellion, and finally decides to leave Ireland and become an artist. What made the novel remarkable was not just the story, but how Joyce told it. The language changed as Stephen grew. The early chapters used childlike words and rhythms, while later chapters showed more complex thoughts and vocabulary. This style, called stream of consciousness, allowed readers to enter Stephen's mind and follow his development in a deeply personal way. Published in 1916 by American editor Ezra Pound, a portrait of the artist as a young man received widespread praise. Writers and critics in both Europe and the United States saw it as a bold, new kind of novel, one that broke with tradition and introduced a new voice in modern literature. Joyce's reputation began to grow, though he still lived modestly in Trieste and later Zurich after the outbreak of World War I. More and more readers and literary circles recognized his brilliance. He was no longer a struggling unknown. He was now a rising figure in modernist writing, mentioned alongside names like T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and Marcel Proust. Still, Joyce remained focused on his craft. He did not write to please the public or to follow trends. He wrote to explore truth, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual truth. He once said, "I am trying to give people one moment of clarity. I want to capture that moment when the soul of the commonest object seems radiant." At the same time, Joyce continued to struggle financially. Even as his name appeared in literary magazines, he found it hard to support his family. He received small grants and help from admirers, but his health problems, especially with his eyes, grew worse. He often wrote while suffering from severe pain or during long hospital stays. Through all this, Joyce began working on a new novel, one that would become his most famous and ambitious, Ulysses. But unlike Dubliners or Portrait, this next book would change the way novels were written forever. For now, though, he had achieved something profound. In just 2 books, he had created a new style of fiction, brought the modern mind to the page, and introduced the world to the deep soul of Dublin, even from thousands of miles away. He had found his voice, and it was only the beginning. Chapter 6. Creating Ulysses. A Day in Dublin. A New World in Literature. By the time World War I came to an end in 1918, James Joyce had already begun working on a novel that would become his greatest and most controversial achievement, Ulysses. He was now living in Zurich, Switzerland, having fled Trieste with Nora and the children to escape the dangers of war. The quiet, neutral city gave him the peace he needed to write. But his imagination was elsewhere. It was in Dublin on a single day in June 1904. That date, June 16, 1904, was not random. It was the day of Joyce's first outing with Nora Barnacle, the woman who had become his partner and muse. For Joyce, it marked the beginning of love, freedom, and identity. He chose that day as the entire setting for Ulysses, a novel that would follow a handful of Dubliners across just 18 hours, yet cover a world of thoughts, memories, desires, and dreams. Joyce modeled the novel loosely on Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, with each chapter reflecting an episode from the Greek tale. But instead of warriors, gods, and monsters, Joyce gave readers ordinary modern characters, a Jewish advertising agent named Leopold Bloom, a young artist named Stephen Dedalus, and Bloom's wife, Molly. What Joyce did with these characters, however, was revolutionary. He broke the rules of storytelling. Instead of a traditional plot, Ulysses focused on interior life, the flow of thoughts, impressions, and memories. Joyce used stream of consciousness writing in a way few had attempted before. Each chapter had a different style, some poetic, some journalistic, some almost like music. Language became a tool not just for telling a story, but for shaping reality. This made Ulysses a challenging book, but also an incredibly rich one. Through Bloom's wanderings around Dublin, going to a funeral, eating lunch, visiting a newspaper office, walking the streets, attending a maternity hospital, and finally returning home, readers were shown a complete picture of the human experience: love, loss, guilt, lust, confusion, kindness, and insight. Joyce worked slowly and carefully, often revising a single sentence many times. He wanted every detail to matter: the smell of soap, the sound of boots, the touch of paper. He filled the novel with symbols, jokes, references to mythology, and details from real Dublin streets, even though he hadn't lived in the city for years. He recreated it so precisely that a reader with a map could follow Bloom's footsteps hour by hour. Yet Joyce faced great obstacles in getting Ulysses published. First, the book was serialized, published chapter by chapter in an American magazine called The Little Review, starting in 1918. But by 1920, U.S. censors had taken legal action, calling the content obscene, especially the intimate and sexual thoughts in certain chapters. The magazine was fined, and the book was banned in both the United States and the United Kingdom. For Joyce, this was heartbreaking, but not unexpected. He had always believed in artistic honesty, even when it shocked people. He once said, "If Ulysses isn't fit to read, then life isn't fit to live." He refused to change a word. His luck changed when two American women living in Paris, Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier, offered to publish the book. Sylvia, owner of the English-language bookstore Shakespeare & Company, admired Joyce's work and believed in his genius. On February 2, 1922, Joyce's 40th birthday, Ulysses was finally published in book form in Paris. The reaction was mixed, but powerful. Some readers were confused or offended, others were amazed. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound called Joyce a genius. Virginia Woolf admired his talent, though she also found his style difficult. Joyce had done something no one had before. He had transformed the novel into a new kind of art, one that reflected the complexity of modern life. While the book brought fame, it did not bring financial security. Joyce still depended on support from wealthy patrons like Harriet Shaw Weaver, a loyal friend who funded his work for years. His health continued to suffer, especially his vision. He underwent multiple painful eye surgeries, sometimes dictating sections of Ulysses to Nora or to hired assistants. Joyce's personal life was also troubled. His daughter Lucia, once a talented dancer, began to show signs of mental illness in her early 20s. Joyce was deeply devoted to her, and her struggles caused him lasting pain. He often blamed himself, fearing that his own intensity and genius had somehow passed to her in a destructive way. Despite all this, Joyce had reached a new level in literature. Ulysses was a monument, a book that captured the noise and silence, the chaos and rhythm of the modern mind. He had redefined what a novel could be. And yet, he was not finished. Inside him, another book was growing, one stranger, darker, and even more experimental. But for now, with Ulysses complete and the world taking notice, Joyce stood at the peak of his powers. He had written A Single Day into Immortality, and June 16th would forever be remembered as Bloom's Day, a celebration of literature, life, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people. Chapter 7. Parisian Years and the Seeds of Finnegans Wake. In 1920, after years of living in Trieste and Zurich, James Joyce moved to Paris, a city that was quickly becoming the center of modern literature. At that time, post-war Paris attracted artists, writers, and intellectuals from around the world. For Joyce, it was a place of opportunity, admiration, and complexity, a place where he would live for the next 20 years. Joyce arrived in Paris as a writer who had already shocked and reshaped the literary world with Ulysses. But he had not yet enjoyed the rewards of fame. Paris changed that. He quickly entered a vibrant network of modernist artists and writers. He met Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein, and he became close friends with Samuel Beckett, a young Irishman who would later become a literary icon himself. Paris offered Joyce something he never had before, a community that understood and respected his genius. But Joyce's life in Paris was far from peaceful. His health continued to decline, especially his eyesight. He suffered from glaucoma, iritis, and repeated eye infections that often left him nearly blind. He underwent over a dozen eye operations. At times, he had to dictate his writing to secretaries or family members, sitting in a darkened room with a patch over one eye. His family life grew increasingly troubled. His daughter Lucia Joyce, once a promising modern dancer, began showing signs of mental instability. At first, her eccentric behavior seemed artistic or emotional, but it soon became clear she was suffering from a serious mental illness, likely schizophrenia. Doctors disagreed on her diagnosis. Joyce took her to see Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, who noted that while Joyce's writing resembled madness, it was a controlled madness, while Lucia's was not. Joyce was devastated. He loved Lucia deeply and blamed himself, sometimes believing that his own brilliance had passed to her in a destructive way. He spent much of his time and money trying to help her, moving her between hospitals and specialists. These struggles haunted him and made his personal life emotionally exhausting. And yet, during this dark time, Joyce was creating, again, a new work that would be even more experimental and mysterious than Ulysses. At first, he called it work in progress, since he wasn't sure how to explain what it was becoming. The idea had begun as early as 1923, just 1 year after Ulysses was published. Joyce was fascinated by language, sound, memory, and dreams. He wanted to create a book that reflected the shape and feel of the subconscious mind, not through realism, but through rhythm, mythology, and multiple languages layered together. He started experimenting with language in radical new ways. He made up words, blended different languages into one sentence, and used puns, symbols, and dream logic to tell stories that didn't follow a linear structure. He described this new style as night language, the opposite of the clear, daylight realism of Ulysses. This writing would eventually become Finnegans Wake, but it took him 17 years to complete. Some of his friends and supporters were confused or even disappointed. They wanted another Ulysses, something bold but understandable. Instead, Joyce gave them a book that was nearly unreadable. On the surface, a riddle, a maze, a mirror of the dreaming brain. Still, a small circle of loyal readers continued to encourage him. Samuel Beckett became one of Joyce's most trusted assistants, helping him type and interpret difficult passages. Beckett once said that working with Joyce was like watching a man trying to climb Everest in slippers. The work was slow, painful, but unquestionably brilliant. Meanwhile, Joyce became something of a legend in Paris. He was often seen walking the streets in dark glasses, accompanied by assistants visiting cafes and bookshops. Though he was famous in literary circles, he remained deeply private and, at times, anxious and lonely. His patron, Harriet Shaw Weaver, continued to send him money, and Sylvia Beach remained a devoted friend, organizing readings and defending his work. Still, Joyce lived with financial strain, especially as Lucia's care required more resources. By the late 1930s, Joyce had completed large sections of what would become Finnegans Wake. The work was published in small fragments in journals, often under the title Work in Progress. Readers and critics debated whether it was nonsense or genius, or both. Joyce himself said he wanted the book to keep the professors busy for hundreds of years. It wasn't just about showing off literary skill. For Joyce, language was life itself, fluid, layered, full of history and mystery. He wanted to explore how humans remember, dream, and make sense of the world, not in sentences, but in sounds, symbols, and connections. Finnegans Wake would be his ultimate experiment, a book without borders, one that begins and ends mid-sentence, reflecting the circular nature of life and history. Yet, as war clouds gathered over Europe once again in the late 1930s, Joyce's world began to collapse. His health grew worse. Lucia's illness deepened, and soon, Paris was no longer safe. But Joyce's mission was not yet over. He had one final triumph to share with the world before the darkness fell. Chapter 8: Finnegans Wake and the Final Vision. After nearly 17 years of writing, revising, and puzzling even his closest friends, James Joyce finally completed his most mysterious and ambitious work, Finnegans Wake. It was published on May 4, 1939, just 10 months before World War II began, and only 20 months before Joyce's death. To many, Finnegans Wake was a book of riddles. To Joyce, it was the ultimate expression of human consciousness, a dream book, a myth, a circular tale of death and rebirth told in the language of twilight and time. Unlike Ulysses, which followed a clear timeline over the course of a single day, Finnegans Wake was built like a circle. The last sentence of the book connects directly back to the first, so that a reader could begin again and find new meanings. The story, such as it is, centers on a man named H.C.E. Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, his wife Alp, Anna Livia Plurabelle, and their children, but the identities shift constantly, blending into history, mythology, and dream symbols. Joyce once said, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." In Finnegans Wake, he didn't try to escape the nightmare. He dove into it, captured it, and transformed it into music made of words. The language of the book was radical. It blended English, French, Irish, Latin, German, and more. Joyce created new words by combining several others. One page might require the reader to decode 10 puns, 5 allusions, and 3 foreign phrases, all in one paragraph. Yet, for those who accepted the challenge, the book revealed strange poetry, hidden patterns, and deep emotional echoes. Some passages read like dreams, river run, past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay. Others seemed like nonsense at first glance, but then, with patience, revealed clever meanings buried within sounds and rhythm. The critical reaction was wildly mixed. Some called it unreadable madness. Others hailed it as the work of a genius. The New York Times called it a book that will keep critics busy for a century. Even now, in universities around the world, students and scholars continue to debate and study every line of Finnegans Wake. Though Joyce was proud of his achievement, the process had left him exhausted and isolated. His eyesight was almost gone. His health was weak. He could hardly leave his home without help. His daughter Lucia remained in a psychiatric hospital in France, and her condition continued to worsen. Joyce never gave up on her. He visited her often and kept writing letters on her behalf. But he could not save her from the illness that clouded her brilliant mind. As war began to spread across Europe again, Paris fell under threat from Nazi Germany. Joyce, always aware of political dangers, arranged to escape to neutral Switzerland. With the help of loyal friends and Swiss officials, he and his family fled to Zurich in December 1940, just weeks before travel became impossible. But it was too late to escape his own failing health. In January 1941, Joyce underwent emergency surgery for a perforated ulcer. The operation was unsuccessful, and complications followed. On January 13, 1941, James Joyce died at the age of 58, in the city where he had once written Ulysses. His final words, according to some reports, were, "Does nobody understand?" He was buried in Flantern Cemetery, overlooking Zurich. Only a small number of mourners attended his funeral. His wife Nora and son Giorgio were there. Lucia remained in a French hospital and never fully understood that her father was gone. In death, Joyce's reputation grew. Though Finnegans Wake remained controversial, it was increasingly seen as the closing chapter in one of literature's most daring careers. Writers like Samuel Beckett, William Burroughs, and later David Foster Wallace would draw inspiration from Joyce's experimental courage. Even musicians and visual artists found echoes of his dreamlike structures in their own work. Perhaps more importantly, Joyce had changed what a novel could be. He expanded the limits of language, questioned the nature of reality, and invited readers to enter the mind, not just the mind of a character, but of a world. His work was never meant to be easy. As he once wrote, "I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what I meant, and that's the only way of ensuring immortality." And so he achieved it. Though few people read Finnegans Wake from cover to cover, its presence is felt across modern literature. Its influence flows like a hidden current beneath the surface of storytelling. Just like the river Liffey Joyce so often returned to a symbol of memory, of life, and of the eternal return. Chapter 9. Legacy, Influence, and the Posthumous Life of James Joyce. When James Joyce died in 1941, much of the world was distracted by the chaos of war. Europe was being torn apart, and the death of a writer, even one as controversial and revolutionary as Joyce, did not make front-page headlines. Yet, over time, the depth of his contribution to literature began to shine through the darkness. For several years after his death, Joyce's works remained difficult and divisive. Even Ulysses, now widely considered one of the most important novels of the 20th century, was still banned in some countries for obscenity. Finnegans Wake was even harder to defend, with many critics unsure whether it was literature, madness, or a joke. But something remarkable began to happen. Universities, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, started to study Joyce seriously. Professors began to write books, articles, and lectures explaining his methods, his influences, and the many layers of his texts. The very things that made Joyce's work difficult, his experimental style, his use of myth, his deep references, became treasures for scholars to unlock. His writing inspired the development of modern literary criticism, especially in fields like structuralism, postmodernism, and psychoanalytic theory. Ulysses became a central text in university courses on modernism. Students were encouraged to read it, not in one sitting, but slowly, with notes, dictionaries, and commentaries. Finnegans Wake became a kind of sacred puzzle, one that required teamwork and patience to understand even a single page. Joyce's influence extended far beyond the classroom. Writers like Samuel Beckett, William Faulkner, Thomas Pynchon, and Salman Rushdie drew inspiration from his style. Some admired his ability to break traditional forms. Others followed his example in creating complex experimental narratives that played with time, memory, and identity. In film, art, and music, Joyce also left his mark. Director Joseph Strick adapted Ulysses into a movie in the 1960s. Composer Luciano Berio used texts from Finnegans Wake in one of his musical works. Even rock bands like the Beatles and U2 referenced Joyce in interviews and lyrics. Joyce, who had once struggled to find an audience, became an icon of intellectual rebellion and literary freedom. Perhaps most famously, the world began to celebrate Bloomsday. On June 16th, the day on which Ulysses takes place, Joyce fans gather each year in Dublin and cities around the world to read passages from the novel, dress as characters, walk the same streets as Leopold Bloom, and even eat the same food described in the book, including the infamous Gorgonzola cheese sandwich. Bloomsday has grown into a global celebration of literature, proof that even the most difficult books can find passionate readers. But not everything was celebration. Joyce's family continued to face hardship. His son Giorgio struggled with alcohol and failed to become the opera singer he had once dreamed of being. His daughter, Lucia, whose illness had broken Joyce's heart, remained institutionalized for the rest of her life. She died in 1982, having lived in silence and shadow for decades after her father's death. Joyce's estate, managed by his grandson, Stephen Joyce, became known for being highly protective. For many years, Stephen controlled the rights to his grandfather's letters and works, often refusing permission to quote or reproduce material. Some scholars criticized this, arguing that Joyce's legacy should be more open to public study and appreciation. In 2012, 70 years after Joyce's death, most of his works entered the public domain in many countries. This allowed publishers, translators, and educators to share Joyce's work more freely, helping a new generation of readers discover his novels without legal barriers. Joyce's presence is still felt in Dublin, his home city. Statues, plaques, and museums honor him. Tourists walk the same paths he once took, visiting sites like Eccles Street, where Bloom lived, or Sandymount Strand, where key scenes from Ulysses take place. The James Joyce Center offers exhibitions, readings, and walking tours. He is no longer the exiled writer rejected by his own country. Now, he is one of Ireland's most treasured cultural figures. His books have been translated into dozens of languages. His name is spoken with awe by writers, readers, and students. Though his writing was once seen as inaccessible, Joyce now represents the very spirit of literary courage, the belief that language can explore the deepest parts of human life. Joyce's work asks readers to slow down, to pay attention, to listen to words as music, and to find meaning not only in story, but in structure, sound, and silence. And in a time when language is often rushed, simplified, or commercialized, Joyce reminds us that words can still surprise us, challenge us, and awaken us. He once wrote, "A man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are the portals of discovery." Indeed, his entire life and the books he left behind stand as proof that risk, struggle, and vision can create something timeless. Chapter 10. Why Joyce Still Matters. More than a century has passed since James Joyce began writing his first stories in Dublin. Yet today, in classrooms, bookshops, libraries, podcasts, YouTube videos, and literary festivals, his name remains alive. Many readers still ask, why should we read Joyce? Why return to these difficult, strange, layered books? The answer is not simple. But then again, Joyce never liked simple answers. At the core of Joyce's writing is a radical belief in the power of language. He didn't use words just to tell stories, he used them to explore how we think, feel, remember, dream, and struggle. Every sentence was carefully built. Every word choice was deliberate. In his hands, language became not just a tool, but an instrument of discovery. For readers, Joyce is a challenge, but also an invitation. His books reward curiosity, patience, and attention. They remind us that meaning can be found not just in plot, but in rhythm, tone, sound, and silence. They ask us to be not just readers, but co-creators to piece together the puzzle with our own memories, experiences, and emotions. For writers, Joyce is a liberator. He broke the rules and showed that you don't have to follow traditional paths to tell powerful stories. You can experiment. You can blend fact and fiction, poetry and prose, history and myth. You can make language dance. For learners of English, Joyce can feel intimidating. His vocabulary is vast. His sentences are long. His references are deep. But he also offers something unique, a chance to grow through struggle. Just as Joyce learned multiple languages and used them to expand his mind, readers today can use his works to stretch their own abilities, one paragraph at a time. Reading even a small section of Ulysses, or listening to a passage from a portrait of the artist as a young man, is a valuable exercise in listening, interpreting, and building vocabulary in context. His themes, identity, family, belief, rebellion, exile, are universal. Even his characters' fears and desires feel familiar, despite the cultural distance. Modern tools make Joyce more accessible than ever. Audio versions of his books let learners hear the rhythm and emotion of his language. Study guides and video lectures help unpack his symbolism. Online communities offer support and encouragement to first-time readers. Bloomsday events give newcomers a way to celebrate and share the journey. Perhaps the greatest reason Joyce still matters is this. He believed that ordinary life was worth writing about. A day in Dublin, a walk to the pub, a memory of childhood, a fight between husband and wife. In these small moments, he found beauty, comedy, and pain. He once said, "For myself, I always write about Dublin, because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world." By diving deeply into one place, one language, one family, he showed us the universal in the particular. Joyce teaches us that every life, no matter how small, confused, or silent, contains richness and meaning. And so, James Joyce still speaks to us. He speaks to the dreamer who wants to break free from the world they were born into. He speaks to the exile searching for home. He speaks to the artist who doubts their voice, yet still keeps writing. He speaks to the reader who is willing to take the long road, word by word, page by page, until light breaks through the fog. In the end, Joyce reminds us that language is more than communication. It is connection, creation, resistance, and memory. And that's why, even now, whether you're a student, a writer, a traveler, or a learner of English, his words still matter. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.